he's also incredibly excited about Flexbox. And that's what he's going to talk about now. So please put your hands together for Vlad Magdalin.
Hello. Actually, none of that information is actually true. And I have a little confession to make and a story behind the confession. Up until very, very recently, I happened to be a Soviet spy. And the story that goes behind this goes back to the early 80s. This was right after Soviet Russia defeated America in the space race and in the Cold War. But what happened right after that is some capitalists, lazy capitalists in Europe and America decided to make something called World Wide Web. And this made America much more efficient. And one thing that Russians hate is when Americans are successful. Also same for Canadians, but only for hockey. Mostly you guys are cool. So then, my two best friends and I were recruited straight out of kindergarten to try to sabotage this new World Wide Web and make sure America does not get too far in their economic pursuits. That is me on the left. In Russia, kids grow mustache very early, but then it goes away. So our main goal at the KGB was, how do we take this internet and make it very, very hard to use? And then make layout hard, make websites hard. So we come up with this system we call tables. And we post some information to ICQ, and some people, they start using it. It's crazy. But then they start making things that are very, very creative. And we think, oh man, that's not good. So we go back to drawing board. We have offsite. So KGB, all my comrades and I, we get together on Lake House. And I am the one in the hat. And my friend Yuri, my comrade Yuri, we are sitting on this boat thinking, how can we make this even worse? So we're floating on this boat, floating. And Yuri says, Eureka. Yuri? We shall call it floats, and we will make it as difficult as possible to make layouts. So we post some information on MySpace. We bribe Jeffrey Zeldman with blue beanies. He wrote a book about it. Went great. Then all the internet started using it. Like 98% of internet now use this technology that we came up on Lake. And come up with very unique layouts like these, with this wonderful technology. From our point of view, this is great success. But then, a few years ago, one of my colleagues, Boris, makes a very successful experiment in KGB and creates another project that gets me the red slip. It's like pink slip in Russia. This project, it's actually a malfunctioning robot that was sent to the US, put me out of a job. So our whole department was cut. So after this, I developed something, what you guys call here, maybe guilt or remorse. So I kind of go back to drawing board and think, my whole life has been about making the web worse. How do we make it better? And that brings me to today. And today I want to talk about a new technology called Flexbox. And before we get into it, let me very quickly just switch my accent. Check. Is that working? Okay, America? All right. So sorry for that interlude. But I actually am really excited about Flexbox. And my real name is actually Vladimir Konstantinovich Magdalin, believe it or not. Thank you, parents. And today, I'm going to do something a little bit different. Usually when people talk about Flexbox, talk about where it's available, how you can use it, how you can write the code to do it. And it usually ends up being, here's some screenshots of code, and here's a screenshot of the result. And what I want to do today is sort of challenge myself and build a site live in Flexbox in front of you guys and show you what's actually possible in 34 minutes. And what you'll see right now is starting from scratch. So anybody could do it. Anybody that has maybe some WYSIWYG experience or has used Microsoft Word before, you don't have to know a lot of the details, some of the things that, for example, Wes mentioned around setting up an environment and getting auto prefixer working. But in order to do that, I have to cheat a little bit. And I'm going to use Webflow, which takes care of some of those details around the edges, but helps us build much faster. And to give you a quick introduction into Webflow, you can think of it as just a fancy web inspector. It's just a blank page. So what you see on the white here is just a web browser. It's what you would see in Chrome, aside from all the actual Chrome, or if you were to open DevTools. So if I do something just to show you how simple Webflow is, if I drag in something like a div block, and I set its HTML tag to, let's say, nav, and I add a class like fancy class or something like that, there's no magic happening. What I just did was I created a nav block with a fancy class that got emitted here. Let's see here. Oh, it doesn't have any styles, so let me just add some styles. And you can see here is every action that I took emitted to a very specific set of CSS and HTML. So let me undo that. That's sort of the basic principle. The other basic principle you have to know about Flexbox is one core concept, and that is the concept of containment and items in a container. So Flexbox has two separate things or modes that an element or an HTML tag can be in. And it can be either a container or a flex container, or it can be a flex item. And a flex item is just a direct child of a flex container. So I can have a div, and inside of it I can have another div or any other sort of element. If I set the outer div as a flex container, that implicitly means that every single direct child of that flex container becomes a flex item, and so on. And you can actually compose these, and each flex item can be both a flex item of its container and can be a container itself that contains its own items. That's the only thing you really have to know. We won't go into a lot of the details behind flex axes and main axis, cross axis, justify line, all that. All that is sort of abstracted away when we're using a tool like Webflow. And to make this somewhat more practical, I'm going to use the Generate conference website as a guide or as an example of what we will try to build. So we're actually going to try to build this little widget here, and I want to show you some of the problems that Flexbox solves directly on this site, actually, and not to pick on this website at all. But if you see, let's see, let me open DevTools and disable JavaScript. What you'll see here is that we currently do a lot of things on bleeding edge sites with JavaScript to do the types of things that Flexbox does. So with JavaScript disabled, you'll see things like items not lining up or not having the same height because they have different amounts of content. And this is actually pretty incredibly hard to do in float-based layouts, CSS layouts. And we can also go to, let's say, the list of speakers, and see this problem kind of playing out again, where we need to build in JavaScript sort of, I wouldn't call them hacks, but JavaScript polyfills to make sure that certain things render the way we want them to. So for example, here we have the list of speakers. And right now it's not a problem because the screen is really wide. And all the names, no matter how long they are, they all fit on one line. But if I start resizing this, you'll start to see some problems. So you can see here that, oops. Somewhere here. You'll see here that some names, like Braden's, takes up 2 lines, so does Sarah's, and what happens, because these items are floated, the way that float boxes work, they sort of hit up against each other, and they can't make room. So we need JavaScript to come in and sort of determine in a given row what the tallest item is, and with JavaScript, go set inline styles to each of these items. So if I if I were to be a user that doesn't have JavaScript enabled, is running no script, or someone who is potentially using a browser that we haven't tested on, they're seeing something that we didn't intend. So what I want to do is kind of start from scratch. And by the way, before I start, Flexbox is ready to use today. It's actually better supported than properties like border radius, which I think the majority of this room has used before, and maybe for the last 5 years. Whereas Flexbox has higher support and much, much, much lower usage out in the web, out in the broader web. And Microsoft has some statistics around this, where they actually went and crawled over 1 million sites and saw which CSS properties sites use. And guess where Flexbox is? Somewhere around here. So at the top end, it's 3% of all public web pages are using Flexbox currently, even though it's broadly available in all modern browsers. And all the browsers that don't support it have already been deprecated, mostly by Microsoft. So what we're going to do is just start with a blank slate. So here I'm going to, I pre-built a couple things just to save time. I created a little header, so I'll move it here to my home page, and I have a footer. So these things are pretty standard. They're not really significant. I don't want to spend time rebuilding them here. But what I want to do is a really common type of design pattern in designs and websites where I want the footer to be at the bottom of the page. And that's actually, especially when the footer content changes and the size of the footer goes up and down, it's variable as you resize the screen. It's actually incredibly hard to do with pure CSS, with float-based CSS. You need JavaScript hacks. You need to either set the height of your footer so that you know it, so you know to set a specific type of margin or padding at the bottom of your body. And all these things are pretty difficult to understand. That's why there's so many Stack Overflow questions around just this simple concept of how do I put my footer on the bottom if there's not enough content, and once there's more content, that content should push the footer down. So what I'm going to do is just create a standard div. It's just an element, and I'm going to call this thing the page wrapper. And in Webflow, we deal with classes the same way that you would write a CSS class, except we have this side panel, which is essentially a better or a different view of what you see in the web inspector with the list of specific CSS properties. And as you can see here, I have like this demo mode on where if I make CSS changes, I can see exactly which code is being generated. So let's say if I change the margin for everything, or the padding, you can see the padding being changed under the hood. So what I'm going to do is put this footer inside of the page wrapper, put the header inside, not the footer, I'll put it inside of the page wrapper, and I'll remove this padding. And I want to do, this site has a little bit of a kind of a gray edge. So I'll just do a quick little border here, and I'll make it a light gray. Now this is where what I want to do between the header and the footer is put some content that will take up the remainder of the space between the footer and the bottom of the page, between actually the bottom of the header and the top of the footer, if the footer is all the way down at the page. So what we're going to do is, for this page wrapper, is use a specific type of CSS unit called a viewport height, and we'll just call this 100 VH. And all that says is, hey, I want this container to be 100% of the current visible viewport. So that moved up, and here's where Flexbox kicks in. If I take a regular div block and put it between my header and the footer, what I usually get is just the height of the content that's in there. So if I put some random content in here, like this rich text element, you can see that my footer is not where it needs to be. And here's where the magic of Flexbox comes in. So right now, this is a display block type of element. What I'm going to do is set display flex. And you can see it's sort of like went all over the place. But this is where you have to start playing around with what Flexbox provides. And Flexbox has different direction modes for the way for the flex direction. So in this case, we actually want our header and body and footer to be in the vertical direction. So we need to set the axis to be direction column. And as you can see, we automatically have the same kind of layout that we had before. But now we can go to each of these individual, we can go to this middle element and say, actually let me add this div block here just so we have an empty element. And for this one, we'll just call it whatever we want to call the that little city selector widget. We'll call it the cities wrapper or something like that. And for this one, this is where I mentioned we have the flex container, which is that page wrapper. And this element that I have selected that is a direct child of the page wrapper can be a flex item, which is almost like a child of the container. And this thing can have its own properties. So what I can say, the default is for that element to just shrink to the amount of content that's inside. What I can also do is say expand to fill remaining space. And all of a sudden, we have exactly what we want. We have our footer going to the bottom of the viewport. And if I add a bunch of content here, so if I take this text element and create a bunch of them, you can see that now my footer is at the bottom of the content. So I'll delete a bunch of these, and we can start composing more of these Flexbox containers to build the layout that we want. So here we can see we have two separate columns, and inside of one of the columns we have like two cities that divide that space. And when we collapse to a kind of a medium breakpoint and lower, they stack on top of each other. So we're going to just do this real quick. We're going to remember, a flex item can also be a container of other items. So even though we have expand to fill remaining space as a property of this item, we can also say this item itself will be its own container. So now this will become a container of other flex items. So here we'll add a couple columns here, and we'll call this city column, and we'll make two of them. And in Webflow, once two elements have the same class, it behaves just like every other type of HTML element that has a class. So if I make a change to that class, it happens to both elements because they happen to have the same class. So what I'm going to do is, for this guy, it already has the direction that we want, which is row, because we have two columns next to each other in a row. And we're going to take each of these cities and give them a take up remaining space in their flex container. So automatically you see that they both fill up proportionally the same amount of space as its siblings. Now we're going to create another element, and we'll call it city. And this city is now inside of this flex container. And what we'll do is make it also, let's see here. Each of these city columns will make another flex container. So you'll start to see kind of this pattern repeating over and over and over, where you have flex containers and items, and those items can be containers. And with that technique, you can compose pretty rich layouts. So here I have the city column, and each of these cities I want to be kind of stacking vertically if there are multiple items in there. So I'll set it to direction column, and each of these cities I'll also set to expand. So now we'll start to see something coming together. I'll actually take the city element and add a background image. We'll start with San Francisco. We'll cover it and put it in the center. And then I'll add a heading. Let's make this an H2. And traditionally what we would do is, go. So we'll just do this real quick so we have just one line. What we would do traditionally is take this city selector and maybe set text alignment to center. And traditionally we do something like a offset padding on the top. And actually let me set the color just so we can see better. And I believe we have the font loaded that's used on this website. So you can see in some configurations, this will actually be in the center, but once we expand our viewport, it's not. And this is traditionally really hard to do in CSS. You have to do all sorts of position relative hacks, and you have to know the height of the element that you're centering. So much so that the CSS is kind of known for its bad ability to center stuff. I actually used to call it center something sadly when somebody asked me what CSS stood for. So instead of doing a padding, what we're going to do is reset the padding and make this container, this item, a container in itself, and then just hit these two buttons where we justify center and align center, and boom, we have a center alignment. And here we'll call this city name, and we will give this a text decoration, text transform. And then we'll take the city and add a couple on this side. And you'll notice automatically, because I'm adding more of these here, it's automatically fitting the vertical space. So here I'll take the city and add a combo class, and we'll make this London. And here, instead of the San Francisco image, we'll replace it with London, and this one we'll call Sydney, and we'll do the same thing. So as you can see now, if I publish this, and a bunch of things are taking place right now. When I press publish, minification, image optimization, all the kinds of things that even Wes talked about in his last talk, all this is happening under the hood to deliver this page. So now you can actually pull this up on your phone, and all this is ready to go. This is the site that we just built. And we can also go into, let's say, a smaller breakpoint, and that kind of looks okay. Maybe here it starts to break down, so we can go back to our main wrapper of city columns and just change the flex direction. And we can sort of play around with the padding and how this lays out. But you kind of get the point that by playing with the direction of the flex, containers and items, we can get this really rich height, unspecific layout very quickly. So then let's actually take this page wrapper and move it to, Webflow has this concept of a symbol, so we'll create a symbol and call it a header, and we'll create another symbol, call this a footer, and we'll go to a new page. And here we'll make a list of speakers. And here I'll do the same thing. I'll drag a div block and call this thing the page wrapper. It'll automatically fill the space because that's what our CSS is doing. Then I'll add the header and footer. And here what we want to do is similar to what we did with the other layout, but we want to show a grid of speakers. And this is very similar to what we have here. So typically what you would need here is either some sort of like bootstrap or foundation, some sort of framework to actually make that grid happen. And as we saw, we need some JavaScript to actually make sure to go in and deal with any sort of height inconsistencies. So what I'm going to do here, Webflow has, as Matt showed before, has this concept of a CMS where we can keep items. This is totally separated content, and content has a structure that we can define. And I just did this earlier where I just said a speaker has a name, a description, which is like a bio, a headshot, picture, and a hero background. So what we're going to do is we have 28 of these speakers because I took them from across the different conferences. And I'm going to drag in something we call a dynamic list. And a dynamic list is just a quick way to work with repeating information that is in the database. And it's somewhat similar to what you saw in the Shopify demo where you have the liquid template that you sort of code around to pull in dynamic information. Except here, you're doing it in a purely visual environment. So first what I'm going to do is say, OK, this list is going to come from the speakers collection. And Webflow automatically sort of starts to make containers for each of these items. And you can, right now it doesn't really make sense what it's doing, but as I start to add HTML elements and binding them to actual real content, you can see that, let me resize this a bit. You can see that each of these list items is starting to pull in actual information from the database. So here I'll add an H2, and I'll make it the speaker name. And here we have a kind of lame layout where, oh, actually, let me change this. Instead of height, I want to change this to min height. That way that little line that we saw disappears. So traditionally what I would do with this type of layout is give each of these items a class like speaker, and each of these speakers I would float. And maybe I would give them a width. And right away we start to sort of fall into the same kind of problems we saw in the other layout that we saw on the generate website without JavaScript loaded. So as you can see here, some lines have multiple, depending on the actual real data, some lines have multiple lines that the name collapses to, some don't. And the way that floats handle that, if we look at we have this thing called the X-ray mode, you can see the bounding boxes of all of these elements are not really uniform with each other. So what happens is the float tries to float all the way to the edge, but it hits another div block that happens to be floated above it, and it says, all right, I give up. This is, I'm going to hang out here on the left. So here is where, of course, we can bring in Flexbox to the rescue. So I'll remove this width. Actually, I have to do it here. I'll remove the width and the float. And what we're going to do is go to the outer list, the thing that has these repeating elements, and we'll just call it like the speakers list. And we'll make this a Flex container. And as you can see, Flexbox just says, all right, I'm going to try to fit everything into this one horizontal axis. If there are things that actually go beyond that, I don't care. I'm just going to stack them one after the other. So it tries to make the most out of the available space that it has and gives each of these specific elements just enough space to render itself. But what we can do is take advantage of a property of Flexbox called wrap. So we can say wrap these children. And we're starting to see somewhat of a more kind of a float left type of layout. But we can go further and say each of these speaker items is going to have what's called a flex basis. And a flex basis, it's almost like, you can think of it almost as a width or height. It's the size of the flex item along the main flex direction. So in this case, it would be the width because we're doing rows of content. And it's the width of that element in its equilibrium state, like when it doesn't have room to grow or it doesn't have room to shrink, so sort of in like the Goldilocks just right state. So what we're going to do is set a flex basis of 25%. And as you can see, we have somewhat of a reasonable layout, and we can start to kind of build this out. And let me make each of these speaker items have a little bit of padding. I believe they have, speaker image, and I'll give this, let's see, what did this look like? So, sort of like a teardrop shape. We're going to give these some border radius, actually, and then reset the bottom border. And then what we're going to do is try to see if we can solve. Right now, we don't have this problem where things collapse down. But if I go to, let's say, a tablet, I can start seeing that same type of problem where some things wrap, some things don't. So what we're going to do is, for each of these dynamic items, for each speaker, what we're going to say is when there is, let's see. Actually, let me finish this layout real quick. I'll add a little link to each of the speaker profiles, add their name into that. We'll call this the speaker link. And as you can see, Webflow is just doing exactly what a browser would do, except it's saving it right away. So because we wrap something in a link, it's giving it this default styling. So we're going to hide the, let's see, going to hide the underline and maybe change the font size and update the color to something that's a little bit more pleasing. So now we're going to go to this speaker link. We'll make it display block so that it spans the entire width of the container that it's in. And I'll give it a little bit of a design. The actual name has some margin that we don't really care about. So we'll take the speaker link, give it a little padding. I think it also has a little border on the side. Nope. Too much border. We'll do a border on the side. And set a color. So as you can see, we have somewhat of a realistic reproduction of that layout, I think. Let's see. Set a little negative margin. And this is something you just have to know. You have to set this as position relative so that it goes above the previous item. So here, if we start resizing this, we'll start to see multiple problems. So here. As you can see, we have a speaker tag that takes up 2 lines, and this one takes up just 1 line. So what we have to do is either load up some JavaScript and go through each item, go through each row, and decide, OK, which is the tallest item. It would be this one, and apply that inline style to each of these, and do that as we resize the browser. But instead, what we're going to do is take this dynamic item and make itself a container, a flex container. And by default, it goes in the row direction, so we have to set it as a column. And this item, the speaker link, we just have to tell it, take the remainder of the space. And maybe we want even itself to be a flex container so that its children we can center directly. Actually, we don't want to center them that way. So we can center them so they're more visually pleasing. And now we can see that all of these elements have the same spacing between the previous name badge and the name. And as we start resizing and things collapse in certain ways, we can see the first row, all of them collapse to 1 line, whereas the second row, because Flexbox works on a row-by-row basis, it's actually saying, all right, everybody in this row, the second element has to take up the remainder of the space. And this would typically require a lot of JavaScript to make work. And we can go even further. We can say this list, this outer list, let's say we wanted to limit it to only, I don't know, let's say 10 items. So this comes directly from the database, so we want 10 items. What we can do is ask Flexbox to give us more control over what these individual items do. So I can go to each of these items and say, you know what, when there's remaining space, even though I have this flex basis sort of in their ideal state, I want it to be 25%, I also want each of these items to take up a proportional amount of space if there's space left. So if I set that, you'll see, and let me actually set this image to 100% so that it's more visible what's going on. You'll see that as new items come in to this list, we actually get a different layout. So if I have 8 items, I get that. If I have 9 items, I have one huge list there if you want it to display that way. And then as I add new items, they automatically fit the available space. And that becomes more interesting if we do something like this, where we reverse the wrap of this list and then show fewer items. So now we have 2 featured speakers, for example, that fit into the space. So here we have a fully responsive. We probably won't dive into making this responsive all the way down, but already Flexbox makes it, just by default, what it's doing right now would require multiple media queries, multiple lines of code to make that layout work. And the last thing I want to show you is a super powerful property of Flexbox that required many, many hacks to work around, even in Foundation and Bootstrap land. So what we have now is a list of speakers, and what we also want to do is show the details for each speaker. And since we already have their biography and their information and their hero image in the database, what we can do is create another page And I'll take this, let's just go home. And I'll take this page wrapper just to save some time. And we'll go to the speaker's template page. Right now it's just a blank page, but this is where we want the information about each speaker to be populated. And what you would usually do is work with a developer or write a template in Ruby on Rails to sort of send a SQL query depending on the URL, the slug in the URL to pull the actual correct speaker, then inject that into an HTML or JADE or Haml template, and sort of merge those things together and render it on the browser. So what we're going to do here is we're going to delete this cities wrapper, and we're just going to add a plain old boring container, and we'll call this the speaker detail container. And we'll do the same thing that we did before, where we say take up the remainder of the space. Actually, let me just add a regular container. And we'll just give this a max width of maybe, I don't know, 800 pixels. And then we'll say this guy will center everything. Oh, that messes everything up. So we just have this container. And then what we want to do is inside, right above the container, create our hero section. So we'll call this speaker hero. And what we'll do is set a example background image. And then in the actual settings for that element, we'll just grab the background image from the hero background of the current speaker. And we'll give this some height. Let's say 500 pixels. I think it was pretty tall on the other page. Oops. Yeah, this is the problem with live coding. Sometimes things don't go exactly as planned. So here we have, we'll add another container. Trying to figure out why this guy is not. OK, here we go. And then what we'll do is take this example image, and we'll set it to cover and center. And here, what we'll do is add a, just to make it really quick and dirty, what we'll do is we'll add the name of each person. Oops, the name of each person, and then a quick bio. This just comes from the, copy-pasted all of these from the website. And we'll actually add back the image that's the headshot. So this happens to be super huge right now, but we'll call this, since we already have a class for this that styles this, we'll call this speaker image. And it looks like this guy is being treated as a flex container. So what I'll do is I'll create a new div block, and we'll just call this, a row, because we want this to be its own flex element that puts these things side by side. So what we're going to do is turn off the default behavior of this container. Let's see here. This row, by default, Flex just says stretch everything to the full height available. We're not going to do that. We're just going to say base everything off the top. And we're going to give this container a little bit of padding so that it looks nicer, and maybe move this image to the left. And what this means, and let me actually increase the margin of this guy just so we get a little bit of a better layout. And I'll put this. So actually, let me put this name in here, and we'll make this speaker hero another flex layout, and we'll put it in the middle, and set the color to be white. And let's see, what else do we need here? All right, so we have each individual person now has a speaker image and information. And now we can actually go through and see what this design looks like for everybody on the site. But here's the kicker. In mobile, we want this picture to be first on top of the text. But in the actual source order, we want it to be second because we want, for example, Google screen readers to see this information first. So what you would typically have to do in Bootstrap is do this really weird offsetting where you would actually put it second, but then push and pull using offset classes to make sure that they look like they're opposite. Or you would even kind of create two of these and in one of the images show it on desktop and then hide it on mobile, and you would essentially have two duplicate pieces of information in your markup. So here, what we just essentially built, let me undo that, is a full responsive site where I can go, let's see here, it's taking a while, where I can go to our page. Here it is. We can go to our list of speakers. And here's our massive list of speakers. I can click through each of these. Looks like we have some layout issues to fix. I'm not sure why that's not loading. But I can also, this is done to the point where it's actually production ready and ready for even clients to go in and edit this stuff. And to show you how that's possible, I can even go to like this edit mode and go to, let's say I have this collection of speakers, and I'll go to, let's say, Ava's detail page. And here I have all the information about Ava. I can actually make changes to it. I can upload a different photo. I can even go to the list of speakers. And here, as external editors, as they make changes to the design, they'll get to see exactly what that change, how that change affects the layout. So that's just I know we messed up in quite a few areas, but I just wanted to show you the power of having this layout system that's pretty much unprecedented. We've had all these hacks to try to deal with all the issues that we kind of worked around today. And in whatever, it looks like we're over, in about 40 minutes, we were able to go from a blank page to a dynamic, responsive, flexible layout that's modern and works on 97% of all browsers. So that's pretty much it. I would love to answer any more questions. We'll be out by our table. There's definitely a lot more possible than what I just showed you, but I wanted to give you a little glimpse of what you can do today. Thank you.